So we'll be in Revelation 11. We're going to start today into a somewhat more well-known section in the fact that it talks about the appearing of the two witnesses. However, I decided to change my original course a little bit, and we will not be talking about the two witnesses yet, because we're going to start with the groundwork that the text itself lays, which is the temple reappearing. In fact, that's going to be the predominant theme of today, because our understanding of the temple, its function, and more importantly, why it shows up here is, I think, fundamental to understanding everything that happens around it. Because clearly the temple means something in this regard. Now, to kind of set a little groundwork, right now, the reason why the Jews in Israel would want to rebuild the temple is because under Jewish eschatology, Orthodox Jewish eschatology, they believe that upon rebuilding their temple, the Messiah will finally appear, because they don't believe that he has appeared yet. And so they believe that if they build a new temple, then he will show up, and then they will begin to usher in their kingdom. Now, their eschatology and their theology get really weird from there. Many of them, at least that are surrounding the rebuilding of the temple, seem to think that when it said, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all the nations," they think that means that all religions can pray out of the temple and that it's meant for everybody to get together. That is obviously not the point of the temple. But what we're going to try to do today is give the whole background behind it, as much as I can encompass in this short amount of time anyway, because I find it fascinating, and we'll answer this question in a bit. But when I was going through this, I started thinking just practically or pragmatically about this issue, because 100 years ago, you would have had a lot of questions about the end of the age and how it would be set up. You would ask questions like, okay, well, it seems to talk about the Jews in the nation of Israel, but 100 years ago, they weren't there. So how do we rectify that? You could look at things like the mark of the beast and say, well, how could that possibly be enforced? How can you prevent buying and selling if physical currency or trade is the means of exchange? And there was a whole bunch of others, even buildup of nations together, acting as one body. It would have been asking a lot of questions, and most of those questions we now generally have a good answer to. So mark of the beast enforcement, well, previously physical currency would have prevented or made it at least very difficult to enforce that. Now with the dawn of digital currency and cryptocurrency, it makes perfect sense. The ability to simply shut off somebody's account. Even during the election, the certain banks that weren't super fond of more conservative-leaning sides were beginning to restrict their accounts, and that was already a hot-button topic. But the very mere fact that that can happen is now perfectly comprehensible. The Jewish nation now exists. There are more Jews living in Israel than they have in the last 2,000 years, like we've covered before. And even conglomerate of nations joining together into single bodies is well known. After the First World War, we had the League of Nations, followed by the UN, we have NATO, we have the newfound BRICS organization, and so these are all questions that we now generally have pretty good answers to. But there's one that has been outstanding for a very long time. It's been outstanding for the last 2,000 years. And as I was thinking through this, I thought, I basically was trying to ask myself a series of questions to kind of think through it, to process the issue. And one of the questions that kept coming back was, of all the pieces that are being set on the board, why is one of the last ones to be put into place the temple? You could have theorized 100 years ago, well, maybe God will have them rebuild a temple, and then the Jews would come back and fill the land, and Israel would be born, but that's not what happened. In fact, in 1948, when the Jews retook their homeland, the question of the Temple Mount came up. And for the sake of negotiations and peace, they actually gave over the Temple Mount to control of other nations. And it has been in control of other nations since. And so that one major missing piece has been kind of sitting in ambiguity for a very long time. And so I was starting to ask, okay, well, why has God made it that is one of the last pieces to be put on the board? Especially now today, we have answers, at least in some regard, to a lot of the other questions. That one we're still waiting for. If you felt the desire to poke into that question, you can go and look up, if you go online and just go to thirdtemple.org, you can see the plans that they've put together. There's another organization related called the Temple Institute. And they've basically been putting together plans on how to rebuild the structure and the priesthood and the various furniture. And so they've been in motion, but they've not been allowed to act on it yet. And so looking at that, I wanted to kind of dig backwards and really try to build up the case I'm going to make. And the first place you want to go, if you're going to look at the history of the temple, is not the second temple, not the first temple, it's not even the tabernacle. If you read through, in fact, in Genesis 12, all the way back at the beginning, you see Abraham, and he has his encounter with God, and he decides to build an altar where he had the encounter, and he names the place Bethel, or House of God. And so from there, you see Jacob show up again into Bethel, and he references the same place, and this idea that there was a place where God could be found, or where they had at least met him, then started to really gain its roots in their history. And Bethel was then the name of that place for a very long time. Even now, you can still find some of these locations where they had built these altars. You may not find the altar itself, but you can find geographically where it was located. So the history of the temple goes back pretty far. Then you have the actual land of Canaan. Right? So Abraham was promised that he would be given a land. He would be given an inheritance of a geographical plot on the earth, and it was promised to him and to his descendants. And so he was then told this would be his, and he was brought out of his homeland and brought into Canaan, and he was kind of shown around, but it wasn't given to him yet. And he would have bits, and there was disputes over the wells and back and forth, and Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot, and that whole account, but you never really see Abraham getting full dominance of the land yet. Well, eventually his sons, and they have their people grow up, and then Egypt comes into power, and then you have the account of Joseph, and he is given away or sold by his brothers, and finally his brothers come to him, and he has them move with him into Egypt. And they're there for a while, hundreds of years, before finally you have the account of the Exodus. And Moses comes up as the prophet and begins to lead the people out after the plagues strike Egypt. And as Israel is led out, they've been given a promise that they would be taken out of enslavement, out of Egypt, and they would be brought to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the land of Canaan, which would be theirs. And so God leads them out and into the wilderness after they cross the Red Sea, and then they are circled around in the wilderness for 40 years because they disobeyed. And their bodies start dropping, and a whole generation dies off until finally God brings them into their promised land. And so now we see them again entering into the land of Canaan. And during the various battles and disputes measured in Joshua and then brought up again in Judges, the question then starts to pop up, or rather the topic of where would they settle the tabernacle? Because that would be the next thing that would show up. So you had the land that they would enter into, but before they ever got in there, God had instituted the law. He had Moses come up to the mountain, and he gave him a series of commandments and sacrificial processes, and in those would be the description for the tabernacle. So they would build a place, a tent, that they could move around and set up and begin to enact the laws that God had given them. And what was interesting to me about looking at the temple, or the tabernacle, was how it was set up, because God would lead them out of Egypt. And Moses technically was leading them, but they were all following something. They were all following either by day, a pillar of smoke, and by night, a pillar of fire. And so the presence of God tangibly on the earth was physically or visibly leading them along. And as it would stop somewhere, they would build the tabernacle around it. And then inside the tabernacle, you go and you read through those texts that often you kind of, especially if you're going through a reading in the Bible in the year, you start to get to those texts, and that's when you start to have to fight the sleep, because it's giving you all these nitty-gritty details down to the nuts and bolts of the layout and the structure, and repeating these commandments over and over and over. But if you look into it, you see a very basic structure show up. And that was, you had the outer court, you had the place where they could perform sacrifices in front of the people. Inside the temple, you would then have the holy place, and then inside of that was the Holy of Holies. And this was the first appearance of this sort of a structure. It hadn't existed up to this point. And of course, inside the Holy of Holies, there were very, very strict laws about who could enter and when. So Moses would go and speak with God face to face, but this was an exception to the rule. Usually it was the high priest who could enter yearly once on the Day of Atonement, or as they now call it, Yom Kippur, and they would come in and the high priest would offer sacrifices both for himself and for the people. And this was a very, very terrifying obligation that the high priest would have, because a single mistake could cost you your life. Aaron's sons found that out the hard way. So the tabernacle was instituted, and it would move around with them. And then finally, after they had conquered the land and they began to settle in, King David noticed as the tabernacle and the ark was being brought into Jerusalem, he became somewhat almost frustrated and began to note that here I am living in a house of cedar and I've got this great mansion, but here's the ark of the Lord being moved around in this tent. And so he begins to make preparation to build a new temple, to build a place, a more physical, permanent location for these things. And of course, God comes back to him and says, I never asked you to do that. But David, of course, really wants to do this. And he begins to set aside the funds and the resources and the manpower and the plans. But God tells him he's not allowed to do it. He's not allowed to do it because he is a man of war and a man of bloodshed. And so he is told that, sorry, you can't do it, but I will give it to your son who will build it for you. And so Solomon is the first architect, the first man responsible for the implementation of the first temple. So the first temple is built. It replaces the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant is moved inside. After the temple has been put together and consecrated, the Shekinah, or the appearance of God, fills the temple with smoke, and it is now official. God now dwells in the temple rather than the tabernacle. And the temple stays there for quite a while. Good things happen, bad things happen, back and forth, and finally the tabernacle, or the first temple, is destroyed. First temple is destroyed, and the Israelites are led into exile. And they are in exile for a while. And we've read this before in Daniel 9. Daniel is asking, as they're in exile in Babylonian captivity, he begins praying that they be released, because he had read in Jeremiah that they would be released after 70 years. So he begins his petition. And an answer is given that we've covered many times before. And if you remember in the 70 weeks and the whole discussion there, what was the event that would kick off the 70 weeks? That would be a decree from King Cyrus would be issued to rebuild the city. And sure enough, you read in the book of Ezra, for example, a decree from Cyrus the Great is issued to rebuild both the city and the temple. And so the Jews are released, they go back to their homeland, and there's the whole back and forth and controversy, and they begin to rebuild the city and the walls and the temple. And so the second temple is built. And the second temple would then stay around for quite a while. And the second temple, again, would have its ups and downs, and eventually we get to the Roman conquering of the land, and they begin to take over, and Herod is then assigned as ruler over the area. And Herod, being the architect that he was, saw the temple and apparently really liked it, because he would then expound on and expand on it. He didn't necessarily tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. He expanded on it big time. And so the temple grounds began to grow, the materials began to become more elaborate, and the temple was just this massive building and complex. And so Herod's temple shows up, and this is still the second temple. And of course, you go into your New Testament, and you begin to see Herod's temple in different contexts. Jesus walks around and teaches in it. He goes in and begins to drive out the sellers and begins to cleanse the temple. And then, of course, he gives his prophecy that it would be destroyed and that one stone would be left on another. And sure enough, come 70 A.D., the Romans decide to put down the Jewish revolts. They begin to invade the land, and contrary to the desires of Titus Vespasian, the temple is destroyed entirely. And I am increasingly convinced that even the last remaining part of the temple, the Wailing Wall, is not even a part of the temple. Because if not one stone could be left upon another, then how is there a wall with stones left on each other? So that's more than likely a Roman fortress that had actually been set up around the area. So here they've been wailing at some Roman pagan heretical wall. But all that to say that that was the last we saw of the temple process. The Holy of Holies, the holy place, the Ark of the Covenant, the tables, and the altar, and so on, all gone 2,000 years ago. So that's kind of the background here. Now we know, as we've been going through these texts, that the temple clearly has to show up again. Because in 2 Thessalonians 2, one of the primary texts I would go to, we see the temple brought up, and it is mentioned that the man of lawlessness would sit in the temple and would declare himself to be God. And he can't very well do that if there is no temple. So that, among many other texts that we'll reference in a bit, clearly illustrate that the temple has to be rebuilt. It has to show up again. So again, I go back to my question earlier. Why is this one of the last pieces God has decided to put into place? The Jews have been brought back to Israel. They've been brought back to the land of their fathers, and they are more numerous there than they have been in thousands of years. Not only are they there, but they've been allowed to persist despite the best efforts of the nations around them. You can go back to 1948 with all the attempts to stop them. You can go back to even 1967. You can have the Six-Day Wars. You can have all the conflicts even going back to October of 2023. And all of the attempts to try to drive them out of the land have not been allowed to succeed. But still the question remains, where is the temple? Because obviously, if you know anything about geopolitical politics, you know that there is something in the way. And that would be, well, I would say twofold. One would be the Dome of the Rock, where the Muslims have their fancy little shrine there. And they are very insistent that very few people are allowed inside. You're not allowed to go take a bunch of media, photography, photo, or videos, and you're certainly not allowed under it. And there's been all kinds of disputes about this and why they're not allowed to. Back during the Crusades, the Crusaders had actually begun to dig underneath, trying to find the holy place and the Ark of the Covenant and so on. And to this day, you're not allowed to go and see what they found. So there's all kinds of disputes around that, and they've just not been allowed to answer the question, was the temple there or not? So these are all big questions that remain in politics today. But really, to understand this, we have kind of the events that led up to the temple. But now we get to another question. What was the function of the temple? Why is it being brought up again? Why was it ever brought up? The Jews obviously have their idea of the temple, and they think rebuilding it will usher in the kingdom and bring their Messiah back. To an extent, they're kind of right, but they're wrong about the timing and the reason. But we'll get to that soon enough. But what was the function of the temple? More than anything else, what was its primary purpose? And that was to illustrate that God dwelt among them. The original purpose behind the tabernacle and the temple was to show that God had chosen Israel as his people, and therefore he dwelt among them. And so this is where you see the pillar of fire, and it was following around with the smoke, and they would follow it around. And this was to illustrate that God made good on his promise to be with them. And so they built the temple, and they realized that if they wanted to go have any sort of communication or process with him, there was a process God had given them. Now, we know God is omnipresent. This is not a theological contradiction. But if you try to say, well, how can God be everywhere at once, but also dwelling in a specific place, that is a dumb question that has no merit. It just doesn't. I don't understand why this would be considered a point of controversy. God's allowed to tangibly appear wherever he wants to. In Revelation, he even clearly is seated on a throne. He is in heaven. Jesus said that he would go to prepare a place, and so he can be in a different place while also being present at the same time, and that's just by virtue of the fact that he's God. But also even in his title that he gives Moses. When Moses asked the question, who do I say sent me? God says, not the guy you met over here near the burning bush, not the guy who is in the land of Canaan that you're going to go to. He says, you will say that I am has sent you. And so even in his very title, we understand that he can be completely independent of the rules of space and time because he wrote them. And so God illustrates his being among them by leading Israel through the wilderness with fire and smoke around the tabernacle. And then in the tabernacle, the priests would then enter to approach God. And thus all these ceremony and restrictions around that. So the primary function of the temple was to show where God dwelt and that he was among them. The second, therefore, by implication, was that it was a meeting place. That if they wanted to perform the ritualistic ceremonies that God required of them to go and perform sacrifices to the Lord, for example, they had to go to him. They had to go into the temple, around the temple. They had to follow the processes that were set in place. So it was a meeting place. Moses clearly goes in and has face-to-face conversations with God there. And so that was the second function. And then finally, we also have the sacrifices. And this is the most well-known function of the temple. Being that this is where God dwelt, being that this is where they would meet him, then it would make sense that the majority of sacrifices would occur here. And you can see the layout of the temple and how they built it. It was clearly designed for the sacrificial purposes. They had the altar, they had the tables where the bread would be, they had the lampstands and the Holy of Holies for the Day of Atonement. They had all of these things structured in a central place for all of it to happen. And so being the meeting place of man and God, it makes sense why this is where the sacrifices were expected, as they were offerings to God. This also clearly pointed to whom the sin debt was owed to, as these were not merely sacrifices of gratitude, but also sacrifices for sin, and sin required death. And so if you were to have walked into the temple or tabernacle for that matter, you would have definitely seen blood everywhere. This was part of its main function. There was just death everywhere. You can almost kind of get an idea of the smell being somewhat difficult to bear. And so if you had walked into the temple, you might have thought this would be a grand and glorious and religious building, and maybe you would get the idea of that. But I think the first thing you might have been hit with was the reality of death everywhere. Because they didn't just kill the animal and then sprinkle its blood. There was a whole process about how they would butcher the animal and who would eat what and how they would cook it and where they would present it. You go through Leviticus and it's just quite the graphic display. So if you walked into the temple, one of the first reminders you would have is that God had said he would be here. And then the second is then it's surrounded by death. So if you put those two things together, it starts to paint a slightly different picture, I think, of the temple and why it was set up the way it was. That if you wanted to approach God, you wanted to attempt to make things good with God, you would be surrounded by death. And so this was par for the course here. It is vital to understand the fact that for all of the sacrifices and laws they had regarding them, these sacrifices saved nobody. The point of the sacrifices was not salvation. It couldn't save them. And there's a few ways we know this. The evidence is pretty obvious. For example, 1, the sacrifices had to be done regularly, which means they weren't actually effective at solving the issue. And you can read this in Hebrews 10, for example, and we'll get to that in a second. In fact, we can turn there because I've been kind of going through these texts a lot in conjunction with this issue. And Hebrews lays out not the tangible effects of the temple, but rather the reason for them. And so Hebrews is a very good thing to go through. But the first was that these things had to be done regularly, meaning it wasn't solving the problem. This was the blood of animals and not men. And there were many in Israel who had kept these laws, and yet they still perished in their sin, something even David acknowledges in Psalm 32, that he realized he still had to have his sins forgiven despite the thousands of animals he would have sacrificed. And so we know that the sacrifices weren't saving anybody because they had to do them over and over, because it was the blood of animals and not the blood of the sinner, and because people still went to hell despite having performed sacrifices. But in Hebrews 10, just a small bit of it here in the first few verses, we see kind of a good summation of the point of these. In verse 1, for the law, since it was only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually, year by year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, they would not have, or would they not have ceased to have been offered? Because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. And then he carries on and begins to explain what he means by that. But one of the basic principles we take away is that the point of these sacrifices was not to save you. They couldn't save you. They had no legal authority to save you. And that is an extremely important thing to remember. And take note of that because I want to build on that in a minute here. Any solution which needs to be applied regularly is not an actual solution, but rather it serves as a temporary patch to delay the inevitable. And it also serves as a reminder that the underlying issue of sin still remains unresolved. So if your doctor came and said, hey, I've got a cure for this deadly disease, so I want you to take it, but you need to take it every month. Or, for the sake of this example, you need to take it once a year. You might think, okay, well, I can handle that. But at some point, you're going to realize, if I have to take this yearly, then it's not actually curing the problem. It's patching the problem, it's putting it off for another year, it's delaying it, it's maybe holding back some side effects, but it's not curing it. Because if I have to retake the same thing over and over and over again, then by natural conclusion, it's not helping solve the problem, it's just delaying it. And that was the sacrificial system in essence. Knowing this and understanding the gospel itself, we can resolve a potential misunderstanding by, I think, many. And that misunderstanding is they make a mistake on how they view There's soteriology. And soteriology is the study of salvation and the gospel, justification. And I think many people think that in the Old Testament, you were saved by performing sacrifices, by keeping the law. And then Jesus came and he fulfilled the sacrificial system, and now you no longer need to do that. And therefore, the way you're saved has now been changed. But that's not true. Many believe that people in the Old Testament were saved by obedience to the law, and that this changed when Jesus appeared to satisfy the law, as though God previously used sacrifices for justification, but then changed how he was doing it. This is incorrect, as we clearly understand that no one could ever be justified by the works of the law nor the sacrificial system. That's the point Paul makes in Romans 3. He doesn't say, well, now no one can be saved by the law. He said, by the works of the law, no flesh could ever be justified in his sight. At any point, no one could ever do the process correctly to justify themselves. It was ineffective. They couldn't do it. Again, they had to do it over and over again. So the sacrifices could not save you. They were never meant to save you. And keeping the law could not save you because you could not keep the law. So we're beginning to, basically what I'm trying to do is work backwards and explain how we need to understand how justification worked in the Old Testament. Because really, as Paul goes on to make the case to the Galatians, and even makes the case to the Romans, none of the people in the Old Testament that were saved because they kept the law. They kept the law because they were saved, but don't flip that one around. Because even David, like I referenced in Psalm 31, explains, or Psalm 32, that he had to still be forgiven. And if you could go read through David's account, he sacrificed plenty of animals. He certainly tried to keep the law, but he couldn't perpetually keep it. He kept breaking it over and over again, infamously so. So that wasn't helping. But then Paul brings up another interesting point that I love the logistics of it. And that's, he asked the question to the people in Galatia who decided that they really needed to start keeping parts of the law again. And again, they had flipped the order. They thought that in order to continue in their salvation, or to validate their salvation, or to build off of it, or to even make it happen altogether, they had to keep the law. And so circumcision became their big thing. And so Paul, to counter them, asks an interesting question regarding circumcision and the law. One of the things he points out, in fact, I'll start making my way over there quickly, is in Galatians 3. But he's going to ask them a couple questions, and one of my favorite questions that Paul asks in all of his writings is he asks when God credited Abraham with righteousness, before he was circumcised or after. Now, it seems like a small point, but he's making a very particular point here. But in Galatians 3, in verse 6, he's going to make a point as to how Abraham was considered righteous, how Abraham was saved. Even so, Abraham believed God, and that was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's a very small point. But the point he is making is that the way Abraham was saved was not by going to offer Isaac. It was not by inheriting the land. It was not by keeping the law, because the law would not be written for another 400 years. He was credited as righteous before God because he trusted him and then did what he was told. And it was because he trusted God, and as is explained elsewhere in Hebrews, that even when God told him to sacrifice Isaac, he thought, well, God can raise the dead. He trusted God even past the point of death, and so that trust, before he ever acted, was how he was credited with righteousness. So Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are the sons of Abraham. The Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all of the nations will be blessed in you. So then, it is those who are of faith who are blessed with Abraham, the believer, not the sacrificer, not the law keeper, not the circumcised, but the one who believed. And, of course, even referenced there, he is pointing to the fact that the Gentiles would not be justified by any means through the sacrificial system, through the keeping of the law, through circumcision, none of that. It was through faith. And then in the same chapter, going on to verse 17, now we'll start at verse 15. Brethren, I speak in terms of human relations, even though it is only a man's covenant, or speaking of only a man's covenant, yet when it has been ratified, no one sets it aside or adds conditions to it. Now he's speaking of the covenant given to Abraham here. Now when the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, he does not say, and to seeds, or plural, as referring to many, but rather to one, to your seed, that is to Christ. So in other words, the promise that he had made to the descendants of Abraham, that through Abraham all of the nations would be blessed, he didn't mean that by mere presence of the genealogical record of Abraham's descendants, the nations would be blessed. He didn't mean that by the mere presence of Israel on the earth would be blessed. He meant that through one particular person who would pass through the line of Abraham, the world would be blessed, and that was Christ. The Christ, or the Messiah, or the Anointed One, one specific person, one particular seed of Abraham's descendants was in view there. And it was through that one that any of them would be blessed and would be the one to initiate justification, or rather to make clear the justification of the Gentiles through faith. And then verse 17, he's going to try to now sum up his point here. What I am saying is this, that the law, which came 430 years after Abraham, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God so as to nullify the promise. In other words, if God made a covenant to Abraham 400 years before the law ever came, then how could the law in any way invalidate what God had told Abraham? So in other words, it wasn't the point, which he goes on to explain here. Verse 18, for if the inheritance is based on the law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has granted it to Abraham by means of a promise. So why the law then? It was added because of transgressions having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator until the seed, which would be Christ, would come to whom the promise had been made. And then he goes on and explains that the law is not contrary to the promises of God, but instead that he institutes the law, and Paul brings up the same point to the Romans, that the purpose of the law was to reveal sin for what it was. Paul also explains to the Romans that the law was not bad. In fact, on the contrary, it was actually so extremely and exceedingly good that that's what revealed sin for what it was. So, this means, going back to the temple, going back to the sacrifices in the meeting place, this means that the purpose of these sacrifices was never to act as a saving action, but rather to direct to the true salvation found in believing God, the very act with which Abraham was credited with righteousness 400 years before the law was ever written. So, the sacrificial system pointed to Christ, it pointed to salvation that would come through faith, and it is that faith that God would supply the sacrifice that Abraham was saved. It was through that faith that David was saved. It was through that faith that anybody prior to coming to Christ was saved. The means of salvation did not change. We began to understand it more when Christ came, and then the Gentiles were now brought into view when Christ came, and the book of Acts starts to break down how that happened. But the means of salvation did not change. Believing God was the issue. Next, going into what the temple was not. The tabernacle and the temples which were built were simply shadows or copies of the real thing that was in heaven. In fact, in Hebrews 8 and 9, it talks about this. It talks about how these are mere copies of the things to come. But in Hebrews, and I'll read this just very quickly, there's only a couple verses, but in Hebrews 9, this is going to be elaborated on, like in verse 11, for example. He says that when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not one made with hands, that is to say, of this creation. And not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood, he entered the holy place, the real holy place, once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. And then in the same chapter, in verse 23 through 24, he says, therefore, it was necessary for the copies, including the tabernacle or the temple, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these things, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands. He did not enter, you notice he didn't go into Herod's rebuilt temple. He didn't go into that holy place. While the veil there was torn in two, Jesus didn't enter into the Holy of Holies ever that we're aware of. He went into the real one. And so Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often, as the priest enters the holy place once per year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And then it goes on to elaborate on that. And so the point is that when Christ died, he went to the real thing, the thing that the copies were based off of. In Hebrews, it also mentions that when Moses was given the law, and he was given the dimensions of the tabernacle and the various furniture, he was told to copy what he was looking at. And so when you see a temple in heaven, which is mentioned later in Revelation, or you see an altar in heaven, which we've covered before, these are the real things that the copies on the earth were modeled after. Many made and still make the mistake that thinking that you need a specific physical location to meet with God. And remember, going back to when David wanted to build the temple, God made it a point to counter David and say that he doesn't need a temple. God chose to institute a temple. God chose to have the tabernacle or to give them a tangible place to look at or to meet with him. But he does not need it. This is the point Paul makes to the religious people there in Athens in the Areopagus. You think you have all these altars to all these different gods, but we ought not think, he says to them, that the God who made everything needs a temple, needs our handiwork. We ought not think that he dwells in temples made with hands as though he needed anything. So God chose a temple system just because he wanted to, because he was going to make a point. And that was really to illustrate the function of the sacrifices. But he didn't need it. It was not necessary. And this is, even today, people still do this. You want to pray to God? Well, you need to go to a church. You need to find a ministry. You need to go to a specific place and in some holy circumstance. And you need to go, and the more religious the building, the better. The more you can be near God, and then turn on the fog machines just in case you're still not feeling it. And you need music to be in the presence of God. And they start to miss the point. God does not need a specific place. However, Jesus would change how we are supposed to view this when he speaks with the woman at the well in John 4. That she says, well, your people say that we would worship in Jerusalem on your mountain, but we think it should be over here, and they're telling us we need to go over there. And of course, Jesus tells them that a time is coming when they would neither worship here nor there, but rather that God would desire they worship in spirit and in truth. Which, again, was the whole point. Paul reiterates this in Acts 17. And then the heavenly temple, in fact, you can get a glimpse of this here in Revelation. If we go over to Revelation 15, in fact, it's mentioned in Revelation 7, 15, 11, 19, 14, 15 through 17, but in chapter 15, you see a pretty clear glimpse of this. And we'll get to this at some point regarding the bowls of wrath, but it really sets the context by saying in verse 1 of Revelation 15, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, holding harps of God. And they sang the song of Moses, the slave of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy, for all of the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. After these things I looked, and the temple of the tabernacle of testimony in heaven was opened. And the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues came out of the temple, clothed in linen, clean and bright, and girded around their chests with golden sashes. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. And it goes on. So here you see John looking into heaven. And not only, he doesn't say there's some mystical temple of sorts, kind of, sort of. He's clearly describing a location, restrictions, people coming out of it, people not being allowed into it. In fact, even the smoke of God's power filling the temple, similar to when he had filled the prior temple. And so you see that there is the original there in heaven upon which the copies were modeled after. And now we get to Revelation 11 here. Because I'm trying to basically set up that if you were from John's perspective, you wouldn't think, oh, there's a temple. Okay, I guess I'll take this measuring rod and go around measuring it a little bit. This would have been extremely significant, both in its historical context, along with its purpose. So the temple shows up again on the earth. A logistical issue becomes a milestone. So, just the first few verses here in Revelation 11. Then there was given to me a measuring rod like a staff. Think of it like a yardstick of sorts. And someone said, Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Now, in case you're thinking, oh, well, this is the same one that's in heaven. No. Verse 2, leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it. For it has been given over to the nations, and they will tread it underfoot and the holy city for 42 months. And then he goes on to talk about the two witnesses. So it's just these two verses I wanted to harp on to kind of set the tone. Because you could ask, I think rightfully so, why is this the context that the two witnesses show up in? Why does he make it a point to be told to measure the temple and to leave out the court of the Gentiles? He brings up 42 months, which is 3.5 years, brings that up, and then the two witnesses. And so, trying to get into John's mind a little bit here, for what to many might be a logistical issue, to John becomes a huge issue. To John, this instruction would have either been oddly logistical or radically significant, depending on when this was actually being written. Depending on who you ask, John is either writing Revelation before or after the events which unfolded in 70 AD, meaning that the temple was either still standing or it was not. Whether or not John was aware of the temple's condition at the time is unknown. He just doesn't make mention of it. John doesn't say, oh, look, a new temple because the other was destroyed. He doesn't say it. At no point in Revelation does he mention the second temple or Herod's temple. Doesn't mention it. However, I do not think that my eschatological conclusions stand or fall based on when John was written. I know that there's a lot of controversy around was Revelation written before or after 70 AD. I don't care. John doesn't make it a big point, and I think there are far better cases to make for the substance and meaning of these texts. Because what I want to focus on here is not whether or not the temple was still standing. It's that John, in the meaning and the context of the temple, would have looked at it as. Now, if John was seeing and writing these things before the temple was destroyed, then this instruction to him would have seemed a little bit arbitrary. However, he would have also taken note of the fact that he was told to measure it. So in other words, I want you to go to this physical location, and I want you to take very careful inspection of it. If John is seeing and writing these things after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, then it would have been a clear indication to him that the temple would be rebuilt in the future. That's something we know now to be true. And so the instruction for him to measure it would have been in some way a means of comparison to what he had previously known, because he would have been with Jesus in the temple at different points when he was teaching and would have been familiar with its location and general layout. So he would have understood by comparison to what he had previously known. In other words, rather than simply being told the temple will be rebuilt, he is instead told to measure it, indicating that something about the temple is different than what he would have previously known. What we can be sure of is that the temple will be rebuilt. I think this is indisputable. We can be sure of it, as the temple is mentioned in reference to the future in both the Old and New Testaments. Most notably in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. It is also in Matthew 24:15, where he says that when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place. And then Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 11, Daniel 12 mention the temple. They mention the regular sacrifices being cut off. And then Ezekiel 40, chapter 40 through 43, he goes and a similar instruction is given to him to take a measuring rod and to go and measure a temple. And in that temple, it talks about God now living with them. So I think that in other ways you can argue means that that's looking into the future. The temple's rebuilding has long been considered as one of the most eschatologically significant events which we await, as it is one of the last missing pieces. And as we discussed earlier, a lot of the missing pieces seem to have somewhat been filled in, right? The governmental bodies forming together as one unit, being able to control buying and selling, even the Jewish people back in their native homeland. These are all things we generally understood. So getting to that question I asked earlier, why has God decided to leave the temple as one of the last pieces? They even appear to have a red heifer set up, and legally speaking, they needed a red heifer to be able to sacrifice it, to get its ashes, to purify themselves, to be able to do any of the temple work. But why is this one of the last pieces? After all, it could have been built a long time ago. So why, at least from our vantage point, does it appear to be one of the last? The best answer, I believe, is to reiterate its function. While the Jewish people have existed for a very long time, both before and after the temples were built, and even the nation or the geographical location of Israel and the Promised Land have gone through many historical events, conquering, unconquered, conquering, conquered, dispersed, split up, 1,000 different ways. The land has gone through many of these events. The actual temple building itself holds a very specific purpose in their history. It was, in fact, even if you think about their exiles, back to the destruction of the first temple, it was destroyed and Israel was taken out of the land. They come back, they build a new temple. That temple is then rebuilt or modified by Herod, but the Jews were still in the land. They hadn't been kicked out. Then Rome decides to put down the Jewish revolt. The Jews are exiled out of their land again, and the second temple is destroyed. And now we're repeating the process. The Jews have restored back to their land, which means that they're now looking to put their temple back up. So while these things are different, there are people in their land and they're going in and out, the temple always seems to have a particular place in that context. It, again, was the symbol of God's presence in the world in Jerusalem. In 1 Kings 11:36, he tells them that it is in Jerusalem where he would put his name, and that this is where, if you wanted to look for the God of the earth, you would find him in Jerusalem with his people who he chose. And it also held the Ark of the Covenant, also known as the mercy seat, which sat in the Holy of Holies, which was where the high priest had to enter before the presence of God for the Day of Atonement. This is where it all kind of came down to, all centered on in the world. Its function, in the end, begins with it being where the abomination of desolation is seen. And this is interesting because you go through most of these eschatological texts. You can go through Zechariah, you can go through Daniel, you can go through Paul's writings, you can go through Revelation. At no point is the temple brought up until the question of the regular sacrifice being cut off and the abomination of desolation. Only in that context does the temple get brought up again. So its function there is tied with the abomination of desolation, and that is seen when the man of lawlessness sits on the mercy seat and declares himself to be God. This is where the temple constantly gets brought back into context. It is to explain the abomination. It is to explain the thing that kicks off the Great Tribulation. It is also then seen to have a function in the millennial kingdom. So here's a fun question, and this has always been the gotcha question, and I don't understand why, and I've never really quite understood why people shake in their boots on this one. People who are not of the premillennial dispensational convictions will say, well, if this is all true, then Ezekiel must be future tense, so then why are there sacrifices in the kingdom? Why is the temple there? Why not? I mean, it really kind of boggles my mind as to why this is the gotcha question. What theologically, what soteriologically would be the issue with sacrifices being instituted in the kingdom? Well, Christ was the sacrifice. True, he always was. Like I mentioned earlier, the purpose of the sacrifices in the Old Testament never saved anyone. So it hasn't changed. So whether they're there before or after is not really the point. And then you say, well, but then the Jews try to keep the law in the New Testament, and Paul really went after that one, which is true. But why did he go after them? Again, to the Romans, he doesn't then say, well, now the law was evil. He says, no, actually the law was good. And here's the really fun part. You see in Acts, Paul is told that he's going to go back to Jerusalem. And when he goes there, they're going to seize him and they're going to lead him away in chains. And all of the cities he stops in on his way back down to Jerusalem are telling him over and over and over, you will be led away in chains. And he says, I know. He doesn't care. Now, what did Paul do when he got there that got the people all riled up to take him and arrest him? What act did he commit that kicked that off? So in Acts 21, verse 26, Paul took the men, and the next day, having purified himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. Now, the Jews then got all up in arms and saying, look, he's brought Gentiles in to offer sacrifices. And then they arrested him, and they had the whole thing there, and he's led away. And that's where Paul goes on his last sort of missionary journey there. But I just think it's fascinating to see that this idea that the sacrifice would be offered in any context after Christ had died and ascended was not unheard of. So in order to understand and to kind of put these pieces together, we have to, again, go back to what was the point. So I look at it this way. Sacrifices in the Old Testament prior to Christ's coming were all pointing forward. They were all pointing to that one moment in time when the sacrifice that all of them were pointing to, because, again, Hebrews makes the clear case that these were just copies, these were just replicas to point you to the coming sacrifice. They all pointed forward. Christ appeared. When the sacrifices were being offered while he was on the earth, they were all pointing at him. You can almost imagine the arrows pointing forward, and then they all start to level off into the present tense. Here's the sacrifice now. He's moving along. And then 30 years into his life, the sacrifice is finally offered. After he rises again, walks out of his own tomb, ascends, now the arrows are pointing backwards. Now they're saying, there was the sacrifice. And we do this even as Gentiles. When he institutes the Lord's table, what does he say? Do these things to re-sacrifice the blood? No, do these things in remembrance of the sacrifice that had been offered. This is my body, this is the blood, etc. And so these are all acting as sort of memorials. So you can almost say that the sacrifices and the laws in the Old Testament were memorials looking to the future. And then the sacrifices here in the future are memorials looking to the past. Now, I know there's a lot of people who will run with that and run way too far the other way. And so many people love the pendulum, and it is simply idiotic, and is just nothing more than a tool of the devil to take everything to its extreme. But thankfully, we're all reasonable. So, we ask the question, why is the temple one of the last pieces to be put on the board? It was a symbol of God's presence in the world, where the Ark of the Covenant was and the mercy seat, the Holy of Holies, where the high priest entered once a year. Its function in the end begins when the abomination of desolation is seen and the man of lawlessness sits on the throne or the mercy seat and declares himself to be God. It has a function in the millennial kingdom, and we see that sacrifices appear to continue on as a sort of memorial looking backwards. And so the fun little trick question I had going into this was, is this third temple ever destroyed? Never mentioned. You can go through any of these texts you want to. At no point does it say that the new temple there, that the man of lawlessness sits in, the abomination of desolation happens in, at no point does it ever say it's destroyed. In fact, according to Ezekiel, it appears to go into the kingdom. And I have no soteriological problem with that, as long as we understand that it is now being properly used. So, because of these things, I would argue that the reason God has the temple as one of the last pieces, and the reason why you only see it show up is when sacrifices are being cut off and when the man of lawlessness shows up, the abomination, the reason why God has this as one of the last pieces to be put into place is because God will not permit the misuse and defilement of the temple for any prolonged period of time, and will instead allow it to be rebuilt. He will allow the abomination to be set up, and then it will be restored. Because if you go to Daniel chapter 8, and it's talking about the sacrifice being cut off and the holy place being defiled, a question is asked. Daniel's sitting there listening, and the question is asked from one person to another. They say, how long? How long does God allow this place to be defiled? And the answer is given to him, for 2,300 mornings and evenings. And after those 2,300 days, then the holy place will be restored. So, it makes sense why it would be one of the last pieces to be put into place, which also means that the time when it is rebuilt is extremely significant, because it means that God appears to have some sort of limit as to how long he lets it be defiled. He even sets up an amount of time, a number of days, before he restores it after it's defiled. And so I would argue that from the time it's rebuilt, you have now a ticking time clock. And I don't know exactly how long, but you have a sort of timer going off in the background of how long God is going to let this happen. And so he'll allow the greatest abomination to have ever occurred, where a man goes into the temple, sits on the Ark of the Covenant as the mercy seat, declares himself to be God. It is at that exact moment that the Great Tribulation begins, and God begins the process of judging the world, and then sets a timer for 2,300 days before he then restores that holy place. So the process immediately begins in motion. So it makes sense why that's one of the last pieces. It's almost like the key to the ignition here. And in case you think that's far off, again, thirdtemple.org, you can see their plans. You can see 3D renditions and descriptions of how they're going to do it. It's a really interesting little side project to look at. But here's a fun little piece of relevant news. So this last week, amidst much controversy, the nominee for the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was just confirmed. And they had a tiebreaker vote and that whole thing. And I know that doesn't sound particularly relevant, but there's one little thing I caught in kind of passing. Back in November, when Trump had announced who his nominees were going to be, he threw out Pete Hegseth, and I think it was the Associated Press, one of the more left-leaning places, kind of started losing their mind. And they mentioned in one of their articles, written back on the 14th, I believe, of November, they said, hey, just so you know, this nominee here for the Secretary of Defense says he thinks that Israel should have the right to rebuild their temple. So this is their you see, he's crazy. Well, he just got confirmed yesterday, before yesterday. And Trump is fairly well known as being pretty warm towards this idea. During his first term, they had actually made a coin, and on the front of the coin was the silhouette of Trump's face, and on the silhouette or the shadow behind him was King Cyrus the Great, who was the one who issued the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, which began the 70 weeks. And on the flip side of the coin was a rendition of the third temple. Now, this might mean nothing, but I also think it is wildly coincidental then. It's just fascinating that this is even a point of discussion. So understanding its function, the rebuilding of the temple is not a specific event the prophet points to. The prophets never say, and on this day the temple will be rebuilt. They don't even mention it. They just assume it. That, oh, there's the temple, by the way, and in that these things are going to happen. But rather, it points to the events which occur within the temple. Considering this and the previous points, it would seem to me that the temple is likely to be built right before, or sometime not too long before, the beginning of the Great Tribulation, either with great secrecy, so you're not knowing, or with great speed. They even speculated, at least according to the Temple Institute, it would take them approximately 3 to 3.5 years to build, which is a fun time frame. In fact, it is part of the explanations for the 7-year covenant the last week that halfway through they would put a stop to regular sacrifice. Now, John is told to measure the temple. This is where I think you start to get more specifics about what he's looking at here in the future. This is clearly an allusion to something that had happened back in Ezekiel 40. So Ezekiel is given a measuring rod, and he is told, well, he's not actually given the measuring rod. He sees a man with the measuring rod who is going to go and measure the temple, and it goes on chapter after chapter after chapter with, again, those little nitty-gritty details. You notice where Ezekiel's measurements are measured in the span of chapters, John is told in a verse, and he's not even given the measurements. He is simply told, take this measuring rod, similar to what you probably heard about in Ezekiel, and go and measure the temple, measure the holy place, or measure the altar, and leave out the court of the Gentiles. And so it's focusing less on the dimensions and more on, all right, this is very similar. So I would argue that it's likely the same temple that Ezekiel was looking at, and similar process. However, Ezekiel's not given the measuring rod, but watches another man measures it. The temple Ezekiel sees appears to be utilized in the kingdom, and is not specifically addressing the events which occur prior to the return of Christ, so you could say that that's the one that goes in. But this would bring up a question. Is the rebuilt temple an entirely bad thing? Is it evil, through and through, for a temple to be rebuilt? Well, yes and no. The reason the Jews will rebuild it is wrong. They think it will bring their Messiah. Spoiler, it will not. In fact, it brings the opposite. But they firmly believe that if they rebuild the temple, the Shekinah will fill the temple again, and the Messiah will appear, and they will bring in their years of peace. But the opposite happens. So, to answer the question, is them rebuilding the temple and is them keeping the sacrifices, is that when they're saved? Clearly not. Many would argue that any temple, and certainly one with sacrifices in it, would be an abomination and a purely evil act, as Jesus has already satisfied the requirement. So, in other words, none ever. It's entirely wrong. However, I would argue that this has a flaw, and as much as it seems to be missing one of the points of the law in the sacrificial system. Again, the law was never meant to save anyone, nor did the sacrifices save anyone. This did not make the law evil, as dealt with in Romans 7. Abraham was saved before the implementation of the law and the sacrificial system. So the appearance of the temple and sacrifices in the kingdom is not a contradiction, like we've covered. It is also important to note that you see obedience to certain parts of the law by the apostles there in Acts 21. And when he returns, you will see the consummation of the ages and the caster of the shadow, which was the law and the sacrificial system. You see the person who embodied all of those things and the point of all of those things. When he returns, he will be sitting on the mercy seat in his temple where everything and everyone comes to him. And so, in other words, the appearance of a temple and the appearance of the sacrifices and the appearance of the Gentiles all point to the same thing, that they were always pointing to the same thing. And so here you see that sitting there. So the temple, as far as why they will rebuild it, their motives are technically wrong. However, I think it is perfectly valid to start to theorize that the reason this happens is because Israel is basically put on track again. So they restart the process. They've been brought out of exile. Now they start the sacrifices again. Sacrifices aren't saving them. Otherwise, Christ would return at that point. So that's not going to save them. But they start doing it. They get back on the road again. And then the temple, and they get back on that, and they start implementing that. And they keep thinking, all right, well, maybe we're missing this step, and maybe we're missing this step. But what you see is not salvation, but you do see them trying. They're trying to get back on course. But that's not how God's going to bring them back yet. It's part of it, but it's not it. Because there's one thing they have yet to do. And so God then sends the abomination of desolation to desecrate the sanctuary and the holy place. The great tribulation begins, and we've talked about this before. What is the purpose of the great tribulation? To purge Israel. 2/3 of them will be killed, and 1/3 of them will make it through the fire, through the purging. And then, having tried the sacrifices, having tried the temple, having tried to keep the law, and even that didn't work, even that didn't bring their Messiah back, they start to come to a conclusion. And so here they are cornered, they're surrounded, and then they start to realize, we missed a step. And they look on him whom they have pierced, they begin to repent, they begin to turn around, God gives them the strength to fight back their enemies, they realize who's giving them the strength, and they look on him whom they have pierced, and they mourn for him, and he returns. Because that's the point at which he will return, and this is the thing he's been telling them over and over again, that he would restore them, he would save them, he would come back to them if they would go back to him, but that's not on their terms. So, here we see that basically getting set up. The reason the temple shows up in the sacrifices is not to save them, but it does start to show that they're getting back on the course that they had gotten off of. So when you see Christ returning, you see the consummation of the ages and the casture of the shadow, which was the law and the sacrificial system, and you see him sitting on the mercy seat in his temple where all things come to him, both sacrifice and saint, as all memorials to his work. So the purpose of the temple, the purpose of the sacrifices in the kingdom, the purpose of all of these things is to point to the one who instituted all of them. In fact, I think it would be fascinating if you take someone like Moses, for example, and you throw a couple other prophets in there, and you take the modern Jews, and they all go in there, and they go in and they start performing the sacrifices, and they start to realize the one who wrote these instructions is sitting right in front of them, because he was the one who gave them the law. And I just think that would be an interesting thing to look at. But again, these aren't sacrifices to save them. These are just memorials, which is technically what they always were. That being said, here's another question to pull back from the people who want to run to the extremes. Should we, as Gentiles, perform the sacrifices? Should we, if they rebuild a temple, go and visit it and find its grandeur glorious? Absolutely not. Under no circumstance would I ever recommend doing that, and there's a couple of reasons why. To whom was the sacrificial system given? God at no point gave it to the Gentiles. We read earlier that God, through Abraham, would give justification by faith to the Gentiles. So at no point are the Gentiles ever instructed that they need to keep them. So we're not encouraged at any point to do that. The fundamental error of the infamous Judaizers was that they claimed the Gentiles needed the same system the Jews had, as though we needed to now mimic everything they did and every way they did it, and that's just not the case at all. Peter clearly had to be brought to this conclusion over and over again, that the Gentiles were being saved through the same means, Christ, but not by replicating all of the same things. There was a difference. But God kind of seems to balance it between the both. He does not condemn the sacrificial system or the law, nor does he condemn the absence of it. He's pointing to the same thing because, again, getting back to basic soteriology, we are justified by faith or trust in Christ. Same way Abraham was, same way Moses was, same way David was, same way Paul was, same way we are. That has not changed. But God is allowed to have different systems in place for different people. But that means we don't have to go out of our way to get there. So absolutely not. If you see the temple being rebuilt, do not go there. Both because they're building it for the wrong reason, and also we're not instructed to. But there's another reason. When they go to rebuild their temple, what happens? They think Usher's their Messiah. Well, like we talked about earlier, the opposite happens. In fact, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place, get as far away from the temple as you can get. This is basically ground zero for what's about to happen next. It is to this event that Jesus points in Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not be, or standing in the holy place, get out of Dodge. This is not where you want to be.
And as we have established many times before, and is indicated by Daniel 9 and Zechariah 13, the purpose of these events will be to purge Israel. So don't get into the line of fire. The salvation of Israel does not occur when the temple is rebuilt, nor the reading of nor the implementation of the sacrificial system. You can go to Zechariah 12. They are saved when they repent and start trusting Christ as their Messiah. But, like we covered, the temple is still never destroyed. In fact, when Jesus goes into the temple, notice what he doesn't do. When you go into the New Testament, Jesus doesn't go into the temple and destroy it. He goes in and, because of the zeal of his Father's house, cleanses the temple. Even Herod's temple, with all of the paganism that likely was permeating it, at no point does Jesus destroy the whole thing. He cleanses it. In fact, it is still called his Father's house. Now, it's eventually destroyed, like the first one, because of Israel's sin, but that was because of Israel's sin. Now, quickly, because I'm beginning to realize how far along I'm going here, but this is something really important I wanted to get at here. So I'll try to move fast. Measuring the altar. Which altar? This is almost certainly the altar of sacrifices. The altar of sacrifices for the regular people would have been out in the courtyard, so they would have seen it in front of everyone. Everyone would have been able to watch the process, at least from some distance or another. So he's told to measure the altar, and then he's told to measure the worshipers in the temple. The reason is he's kind of setting a basis, so you start to understand what's missing from his measurements here. This is confirmed by Ezekiel 40, verse 47. He talks about the altar that is located outside or in front of the temple. So that's the altar. The usage of the word measure is clearly in reference to determining the dimensions of something, just like Ezekiel. But it also means to take an accounting of or estimation of the object or objects in question, meaning twofold. One, inventory. He goes and he says, all right, so here's holy place, the temple, here is the altar, here are people worshiping in it, but we are missing the court of the Gentiles. So mark that one off. So that's one of the reasons to measure. It also means that it's a physical object, that it is tangibly there. This is not some spiritual altar. He is measuring it. It has actual dimensions. It is present, and it's on the earth. So this is to indicate two things. The temple and the altar are rebuilt and can be measured as real, tangible, and physical objects. And then secondly, the sacrificial system is started again in the temple. This is where it's going down. This is confirmed by the order to put a stop to sacrifices. You can't stop what hasn't started, and that's mentioned in Daniel 8:11, 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. Sacrifices all show up in Ezekiel's temple. So you see sacrifices and therefore an altar. And we can be sure that this is in reference to a physical temple in Jerusalem because not only the fact that the court of the Gentiles is left out because the nations are trampling it, but because in the very same chapter, in verse 8, it tells us where the two witnesses are and where they die. And he's told to measure the people, or rather to take an account or measurement of the people in the temple, or the worshipers. In case it wasn't clear enough, John is told to take note and account of the fact that there are people worshiping in the temple itself. And so, in other words, combine this with the temple being measurable and the altar, and now there's people serving in it. This isn't just some model. This isn't just for memorial purposes. It's here. It's being utilized, in other words. But the purpose of these measurements is to make clear what is not there. Do not measure the court of the Gentiles. Now, geographically, the court of the Gentiles was located to the south. So if you were facing north, you would have the court of the Gentiles, and then you go down northern-wise, and you would have the holy place, and so on. Now, this, kind of as a last point here, I think, is fascinating, because we've talked about this before, talking about the Battle of Armageddon and where it goes down. Why tell us to leave out the court of the Gentiles? What's the point of that? Did they just forget? Did they omit it from the drawings and the floor plans? Or are they not allowed to build it? Is something in the way, or is something preventing them? Now, many have speculated it's the Dome of the Rock, and so they're going to build a temple next to it, and in order to make room for that, because it is the southernmost point, the court of the Gentiles, therefore you would have the Dome of the Rock, and then under it, if you're facing north, you would have the temple. That's been one speculation. I think that's kind of okay, but that assumes that the Dome of the Rock is located correctly on the Temple Mount. But I think there's a better reason to speculate. Half of the complex is rebuilt. The court of the Gentiles is pretty big, obviously, because it holds a lot of people in it. It's pretty big, which means half of the complex is missing. Per Zechariah 14:2, half of the city will be taken as the nations are gathered against Israel. Per Luke 21:24, the city of Jerusalem is given over, using the same wording here, to be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. We've talked about this last time. The Jews will not be allowed to own all of Jerusalem until the very end. And even to this day, East Jerusalem, if you're a Gentile, and more specifically, if you are a Jew, and visibly so, if you ever travel to Israel and you go to Jerusalem, do not go to East Jerusalem. It's technically not safe there right now. That's where the Palestinian Authority is based out of. So even now, half of the city is not permitted to be owned by the Jews. But here it's saying half of the temple complex is also still missing, and that for the motive of the fact that the Gentiles own it. That the Gentiles, even though it's the court of the Gentiles, the Jews aren't even allowed to build a wall around it. They're not allowed to own any part of this southern portion of the complex. So half of the city is taken when the nations gather against Israel. This would indicate to us a couple of interesting facts. Israel will not be allowed to have complete control of Jerusalem, like we just covered. Even today, they don't. And then the direction of what half of the city is taken. So if the court of the Gentiles is the southern half, then that would mean that the southern half of the city is likely the portion that's taken. Now that, I think, is interesting, because we go to our understanding of the enemy, what nations surround the world. What direction does the enemy come from? From the north. This is mentioned in Daniel 11. It keeps referring to the last king as the king of the north. Over and over, it comes from the north. As we covered last time, or a couple times ago, at the Battle of Armageddon, the valley that the nations are gathered into is into the north of Israel, to the north of the temple complex, which basically means you have sandwiched or surrounded the people. Now, the term surrounded should ring a bell. So to end, we'll go with Joel chapter 9. And I just think that this is I think it's neat. You might not, maybe I'm just stretching it, but I think this is neat, that God has basically narrowed down to us the specifics, the geographical specifics about how these things are going to go down. If I can remember. There we are. So in Joel chapter 3, and Joel is before the book of Amos, in case you're lost. In Joel chapter 3, the declaration is given. And Joel is clearly in reference to the end of the age, at least most of it. In verse 9, proclaim this among the nations. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men, and let all of the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and beat your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a mighty man. Hasten and come, all of you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. So he's gathering all of the military-aged and capable fighting men to this one specific spot. All of the nations, all of these surrounding nations will be brought. Bring down your mighty ones, let the nations be aroused, and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all of the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come and tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. And the sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness, and the Lord roars from Zion, and he utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth tremble. But the Lord is a refuge for his people, and a stronghold for the sons of Israel. And then you will know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. So Jerusalem will be holy, and strangers will pass through it no more. So all of it is coming down to this one specific spot. So why the temple? Why does it matter? Because where God dwells, where the sacrifices go down, where the abomination goes down, is built apparently around the last of the remaining pieces to go. It is centered there. But they're not allowed to have control of the south. Half of the city is taken. It could be that they're surrounded around the temple like they were in 70 AD. And now the enemy is coming in from the north. They're encompassed. They've got no way out. 2/3 of their numbers are dead. And it is at that point that they remember, like it says in Zechariah, that God is their refuge. God is the answer. God is the solution. God is the one who rouses them up for war. And God is the one who gives them the victory. And so they begin to turn around. They repent. And like we covered at that time when we were covering this issue again, Christ apparently comes and descends from the same direction as the enemy and plants his feet on the Mount of Olives and settles the issue there. So I just think that's fascinating. And next time we'll get into the two witnesses. And here's a fun question. And it's tying to the same thing, by the way. The two witnesses have a different title. In fact, you can find the two witnesses mentioned in two different places in the Bible. Here in Revelation 11, and they're mentioned in one other place. And that would be the book of Zechariah. They are called the two olive trees, which stand before the Lord, just like they are here. Why do they show up here? Why is this context of the temple brought up here? Why is this where he mentions them? Well, that's a question we'll answer next time. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this glimpse into the future, but I ask that we take it seriously, that we take it to account, and that we understand that as troubling as the world's events may be, we understand that all of them are moving in a very particular direction, and that we get such clear insight into what is coming, and that we have no need to be dreading it or afraid of it, but that we can look forward to it even in the misuse and perversion of your laws and institutions. Thank you for these things and for this time. What is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.